Have you ever stood in a room full of monsters and dared to be the only person with a soul? Tamsin Vane did, and the price she paid was a target on her back that no amount of money could erase. She was just an invisible waitress at the Emerald Vault, a place where senators and kings trade lives like currency, barely managing to keep her head above water. But when she saw a corrupt politician use a trembling, silent child as a prop for a sadistic joke, Tamsin didn't think about her empty bank account or her own safety. She dropped her tray, stepped into the circle of power, and put her body between the boy and the men who owned the city. She expected to be destroyed. She expected to disappear. What she didn't expect was for the most dangerous man in the room, Dante Moretti, to stand up and bring the entire world to a chilling silence. This isn't just a story about a waitress who survived. It's the beginning of a shadow war that will burn the elite to the ground and a romance forged in the heart of a lion's den. Have you ever stood in a room full of monsters and dared to be the only person with a soul? Tamsin Vane did, and the price she paid was a target on her back that no amount of money could erase. The air inside the Emerald Vault was thick with the scent of aged cognac and the heavy, metallic tang of unchecked power. It was a place where the chandeliers were made of hand-cut crystal and the floorboards were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the faces of men who thought they were gods. Tamsin moved through the room like a ghost, her uniform pressed and her eyes downcast. At 26, she had learned the art of being invisible. It was the only way to survive a city that had already taken her father's legacy and her mother's health. She needed this job. Every tray of overpriced hors d'oeuvres she carried was a step closer to keeping her brother out of a legal system that favored the wealthy. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. The private summit in the back lounge wasn't just about business. It was about cruelty. At the center of the velvet-draped room sat Senator Sterling, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Beside him, trembling so violently his teeth chattered, was a boy no older than 7. Lau. He was dressed in a miniature suit that looked like a costume, his small hands gripped white-knuckled around the edges of a chair. He was mute, his silence a vacuum in the middle of the room's raucous laughter. "Watch this," Sterling chuckled, leaning toward the boy with a lit cigar. "The brat doesn't even cry. It's like he isn't even human. Just a broken little doll." The men around the table leaned in, their faces twisted into masks of sick curiosity. They weren't looking at a child. They were looking at a plaything. The club manager, a sniveling man named Holloway, stood by the door, nodding in sycophantic agreement. No one moved to stop it. No one even breathed a word of protest. Tamsin felt the tray in her hands tremble. Her background in social work, the life she'd been forced to abandon, screamed at her. She saw the terror in Leo's wide, dark eyes, a look that said he had long ago realized that no one was coming to save him. Sterling reached out, the glowing ember of the cigar inches from the boy's small hand. The crash of shattering porcelain shattered the silence. Tamsin didn't remember moving. She only knew that her tray was on the floor, and she was standing between the senator and the boy. She had shoved her way past a lobbyist and physically shielded Leo, her shadow falling over him like a protective shroud. "That's enough," Tamsin said. Her voice was low, but in the sudden vacuum of the room, it sounded like a thunderclap. The senator froze, his eyes snapping up to hers. "What did you just say to me, girl?" "I said that's enough," Tamsin repeated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "He's a child, not a prop for your amusement. Put the cigar out." Holloway, the manager, rushed forward, his face turning a mottled purple. "Vane, what the hell are you doing? Get out. You're fired. Security, get this lunatic out of here." Tamsin didn't budge. She felt Leo's tiny hand reach out and catch the fabric of her apron. He was shaking, but for the first time, he wasn't looking at the floor. He was looking at her. She knew in that instant that she had just signed her death warrant. Sterling was a man who buried people for less than a sideways glance. To humiliate him in front of his peers was a terminal offense. 2 heavy-set security guards moved in, their hands reaching for her arms to drag her into the darkness of the hallway where the cameras didn't reach. Tamsin braced herself, closing her eyes, waiting for the impact. "Sit down." The voice didn't come from the senator. It came from the head of the table, from a man who had remained a silent observer in the shadows until this exact moment. Dante Moretti stood up. He was a silhouette of absolute authority, tall and broad-shouldered, draped in a suit that cost more than Tamsin would earn in a decade. As he stepped into the light, the room fell into a deathly, suffocating hush. Even Sterling blanched, the cigar falling from his nerveless fingers and scorching the expensive rug. Dante didn't look at the senator. He didn't look at the security guards, who had frozen mid-step as if turned to stone. His gaze was fixed entirely on Tamsin. It was a piercing, predatory stare that seemed to read every secret she had ever kept. "The girl stays," Dante said, his voice like velvet over gravel. "Dante, please," Sterling stammered, his bravado evaporating. "She's just a waitress." She stepped out of line. "I saw what you were doing," Dante interrupted, walking slowly around the table. The click of his leather shoes on the floor sounded like the ticking of a countdown. He stopped inches from Tamsin, his presence so overwhelming she could feel the heat radiating from him. He looked down at Leo, then back at Tamsin, and I saw what she did. He turned his head slightly toward Holloway. "You fired her?" "Ah, yes, sir." "She's a liability," Holloway squeaked. "Good," Dante said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Because as of this second, I'm buying her contract. And the boys. This club is no longer fit for their presence." He reached out a hand, not toward the senator, but toward Tamsin. "Come with me, Tamsin Vane," he whispered. "The monsters in this room are nothing compared to the ones I'm going to help you burn." Tamsin looked at his hand, then at the terrified boy clinging to her leg. She knew that stepping out of this room with Dante Moretti meant leaving her old life behind forever. But as she looked at the senator's hateful face, she realized she would rather walk into the lion's den than stay one more second in the company of jackals. She took his hand. The silence in the room was absolute, the power having shifted so violently that the air itself felt thin. One man had stood up, and for the first time in Tamsin's life, the world went quiet enough for her to finally hear her own strength. The world outside the Emerald Vault was a blur of neon lights and rain-slicked pavement, but inside Dante Moretti's armored SUV, the silence was heavy enough to feel. Tamsin sat in the plush leather seat, her heart still racing a mile a minute. Beside her, Leo had finally stopped shaking, though he remained pressed against her side as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. Across from them sat Dante, his silhouette dark and imposing against the passing city lights. He hadn't spoken since they left the club, but his presence was a constant, vibrating force that filled the small space. "Where are we going?" Tamsin finally whispered, her voice cracking. She thought of her small apartment, the unpaid bills on the counter, and her brother who would be waiting for her to come home with the night's tips. "To a place where the senator's reach ends," Dante replied, his eyes never leaving the window. "Which in this city is a very short list. You made a choice tonight, Tamsin. You didn't just save a boy. You declared war on a man who owns the police, the courts, and the governor. You can't go back to your old life. It doesn't exist anymore." The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. She realized with a sinking dread that he was right. Sterling wouldn't just fire her. He would erase her. The SUV began to climb, leaving the grime of the city behind for the winding, tree-lined roads of the North Shore. Eventually, they reached a massive iron gate that swung open silently. Beyond it lay a fortress masquerading as a mansion, a sprawling estate of stone and glass perched on a cliff overlooking the churning gray waters of Lake Michigan. As the car pulled into the heated circular drive, a team of men in dark suits appeared from the shadows. They didn't look like the club's security. These men moved with the precision of soldiers. One of them opened the door, and Dante stepped out, gesturing for Tamsin to follow. "Welcome to the Lion's Den," Dante said, though there was no warmth in the greeting. "This is my home. For now, it is your sanctuary. But understand this, within these walls, my word is the only law that matters. They were led into a grand foyer that smelled of beeswax and cold stone. Tamsin clutched Leo's hand, her eyes darting around the cavernous space. It was beautiful, but it felt like a cage, a gilded, impenetrable cage. A woman in a sharp gray suit approached them, her face an unreadable mask of professional efficiency. "This is Elena," Dante introduced. "She will show you to your quarters. Ensure the boy is fed and comfortable. I will expect you in the library in 1 hour." "Wait," Tamsin said, stepping forward. "I need to call my brother. He'll be worried. I need to tell him I'm okay." Dante paused at the foot of the stairs, turning back to look at her. The moonlight through the clear-story windows caught the silver in his hair. "Your brother is already being moved to a safe house. If you call him, you provide a signal that Sterling's hackers can trace in seconds. You are dead to the world, Tamsin. That is the only way you stay alive." Without another word, he vanished up the stairs. Elena led them through a maze of hallways to a suite that was larger than Tamsin's entire apartment. There were soft rugs, a fireplace already crackling with warmth, and a bed that looked like a cloud. Leo immediately gravitated toward a corner filled with books and wooden toys, his small hands reaching out to touch them with a reverence that broke Tamsin's heart. "He hasn't spoken in 3 years, Elena said softly, startling Tamsin. "Not since the night the Moretti estate in Italy was burned to the ground. He was the only survivor found in the rubble." Tamsin turned to her, her brow furrowed. "Dante said he was his nephew. Why was he with the senator?" Elena's expression hardened. "That is for Mr. Moretti to explain. But know this, Miss Vane. Dante has spent every waking hour and millions of dollars searching for that boy. The men in that club tonight, they weren't just business associates. They were the ones who kept Leo hidden. They were the ones who used him to keep Dante at bay." The realization settled in Tamsin's gut like a lead. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a recovery. And she had walked right into the middle of a blood feud that spanned continents. An hour later, Tamsin found herself standing before the massive oak doors of the library. When she pushed them open, she found Dante sitting behind a desk littered with monitors and maps. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes more pronounced in the dim lamplight. "Sit," he commanded. Tamsin sat in the leather chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. Who is he really, Dante? And why was the senator treating him like a toy? Dante leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. "Leo is the heir to the Moretti legacy. My sister's son. After the fire, he was taken by people we thought were allies. They told me he was dead. But Sterling is part of a collective that deals in more than just legislation. They deal in leverage. Leo was their ultimate insurance policy against me." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Tonight, you broke the stalemate. You forced their hand. They didn't expect a waitress to have more courage than the most powerful men in Chicago. But now they know I have him, and they know you are the reason why." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photos of Tamsin at the diner at the grocery store, walking her brother to the bus. "They've been watching you for weeks, Tamsin, not because of who you are, but because you were the one who served them. You were the invisible variable. They thought you wouldn't notice. They thought you wouldn't care." "I always care," Tamsin whispered. "I know," Dante said, and for a split second his voice softened. "That's why you're still alive. But being a waitress won't save you now. If you want to protect that boy, you have to become something else. You have to become the kind of person they never see coming." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark lake. "Tomorrow, your training begins. You will learn to move in their world, to speak their language, and to strike when they least expect it. You aren't just a governess, Tamsin. You are my most valuable asset. And together, we are going to burn Senator Sterling's world to the ground." Tamsin looked at the folder, then at the man standing by the window. She thought of Leo's silent, wide eyes and her brother's safety. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her chest, but beneath it, a new feeling was beginning to stir. It was a spark of defiance, a refusal to be a victim any longer. "When do we start?" she asked. Dante turned, a predatory glint in his eyes. "We already have. The training grounds of the Moretti estate did not resemble a gym. They felt like a cathedral dedicated to the art of survival. The air here was thin, chilled by the mountain altitude and the sterile scent of gun oil and floor wax. Tamsin stood in the center of the reinforced glass atrium, her reflection caught in the polished surfaces, a woman who looked nothing like the exhausted waitress who had dropped a tray in the Emerald Vault only days prior. She was dressed in tactical blacks, the fabric hugging her frame like a second skin, a physical manifestation of the armor Dante was teaching her to build around her heart. Dante Moretti did not enter a room so much as he reclaimed it. He moved with a predatory grace that made the expansive space feel suddenly cramped. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he tossed a weighted practice pistol toward her. Tamsin caught it, the cold steel surprising her palms, its weight a heavy reminder of the world she had inherited. "You have the instinct to protect," Dante said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to echo off the glass walls. "But instinct without discipline is just a faster way to get killed. In this world, Tamsin, the person who cares the most, is usually the first to bleed. You shielded Leo with your body. That was noble. It was also a tactical disaster." He moved behind her, his presence a wall of heat against her back. He reached out, his large, calloused hands adjusting the grip of her fingers on the weapon, his touch professional yet electrifying. "If you die, the boy has no one. Your life is no longer a currency you can spend on a whim. It is the primary asset in his security detail. Do you understand?" Tamsin nodded, her breath hitching as she stared down the sights of the unloaded weapon at a silhouette target 50 yards away. "I've spent my whole life being invisible, Dante. I thought that was my strength. I thought if I didn't make a sound, I was safe." "Visibility is a choice," Dante countered, stepping back to watch her. "The senator and his cabal see you as a bug to be crushed because they think you are beneath their line of sight. We're going to turn that invisibility into a weapon. They won't see you coming because they have spent decades training themselves to ignore people like you." The morning was a blur of grueling physical exertion and cognitive overload. Dante was a relentless shadow, pushing her until her lungs burned and her muscles screamed. He taught her the first lesson of his world. The fortress is not built of stone, but of information. He walked her through the digital architecture of the estate, showing her the hidden nodes and the encrypted frequencies that pulse through the walls like a nervous system. "Every door in this house is a lie," he explained, tapping a seamless panel in the library that slid back to reveal a bank of monitors. "They're designed to lead an intruder into a kill box while the assets, you and Leo, are moved through the veins of the building." As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the estate, the intensity shifted from the physical to the psychological. They sat in the dim light of the study, a spread of dossiers between them. These were the monsters of the Emerald Vault, men with pristine public records and private lives built on the bones of the vulnerable. "To beat them, you have to understand the geometry of their greed," Dante said, pointing to a photo of Senator Sterling. "He doesn't fear the law. He owns the law. He fears embarrassment. He fears the loss of the image he has cultivated. We aren't just going to stop him, Tamsin. We're going to unmake him." Tamsin looked at the photos, her fears slowly being replaced by a cold, sharpening resolve. She realized then that Dante's estate wasn't just a home. It was a laboratory where he was refining her into something lethal. He wasn't just her protector. He was her architect. "Why me?" she asked softly, her eyes meeting his across the desk. "You could have hired any mercenary in the world to watch Leo. Why bring a waitress into your inner circle?" Dante leaned forward, the shadows catching the sharp angles of his face. For a moment, the mask of the underworld kingpin slipped, revealing a glimpse of the man who had lost everything to the same monsters they were now hunting. "Because mercenaries fight for a paycheck. You fought for a child you didn't even know. I could teach a soldier how to shoot, but I can't teach a human being how to have a soul. You have the one thing Sterling can't buy, and it's the only thing that can actually destroy him." As Tamsin retired to her quarters that night, the weight of the pistol still seemed to ghost against her palm. She looked out the window at the perimeter lights flickering in the dark. She was no longer the victim of circumstance. She was a student of the shadow. The first lesson was over. Survival was no longer about hiding. It was about preparing for the moment she would finally strike back. The peace of the Moretti estate was never a true silence. It was a calibrated hum of high-end security and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the ventilation systems. Tamsin had grown accustomed to the routine, the way the shadows in the hallways seemed to bend in deference to Dante's presence. But on this night, the hum changed. It was a subtle shift, a momentary flicker in the lights that lasted less than a heartbeat. But the training Dante had drilled into her over the past weeks made the hair on her arms stand up. She was in the nursery, watching Leo sleep. The boy, who had finally begun to take deeper, less frantic breaths in his sleep, stirred as the electronic lock on the door gave a soft, discordant click. It wasn't the melodic chime of an authorized entry. It was the sound of a system being forced. "Leo," Tamsin whispered, moving to the bed with a speed that surprised even her. She didn't shake him. She placed a firm, grounding hand over his mouth and leaned into his ear. "It's time for the game, Leo. The tunnels. Now." The boy's eyes snapped open, wide and dark with a familiar terror, but he didn't scream. He saw the cold, focused clarity in Tamsin's gaze and nodded. She pulled him from the bed, grabbing the small emergency pack hidden behind the headboard. Just as they reached the heavy oak wardrobe that concealed the entrance to the service tunnels, the sound of suppressed gunfire coughed in the distance. The breach was not an external assault. It was a surgical strike from within. Someone had handed over the master codes. Someone Dante trusted had sold the coordinates of the fortress's heart. "Stay behind me, and don't let go of my jacket," Tamsin commanded, her voice a low, steady anchor. She slid the false back of the wardrobe open and ushered Leo into the darkness of the narrow transit corridor. The air in the tunnels was damp and smelled of concrete and old copper. As she sealed the hatch behind them, the monitor she had learned to read in Chapter 3 flashed in her mind. She knew the layout, the veins of the house that Dante had promised would lead them to safety. But as she checked the small handheld tablet she'd snatched from the charging dock, her blood ran cold. The security feed showed shadows moving through the main hall, men in tactical gear, moving with the precision of ghosts. They weren't just looking for Dante. They were heading straight for the nursery. A voice crackled over her hidden earpiece, distorted by the jamming signal the invaders had deployed. "Tamsin, move to sublevel 3. The traitor is—" The line went dead with a burst of static. Dante. He was alive, but he was fighting a war on the upper floors to draw the fire away from them. Tamsin felt a surge of adrenaline that threatened to turn into panic, but she forced it down, visualizing the kill boxes Dante had described. If she stayed on the main path, she was leading Leo into a trap. She looked at the boy. He was trembling, his small hand white-knuckled as he gripped her sleeve. She realized, then, that she was no longer the waitress who needed protecting. She was the only wall standing between this child and the abyss. "We're going a different way," she whispered. She led him through a vertical maintenance shaft, her fingers slipping on the cold iron rungs. Above them, the muffled thud-thud of boots on the floorboards sounded like a heartbeat. The assassins were directly overhead. Tamsin held her breath, pinning Leo against the wall as a flashlight's beam sliced through the gaps in the floor grating above. The light lingered, searching before moving on. They reached the service tunnels that bypassed the estate's main power core. The heat was intense, the roar of the generators providing a cover for their footsteps. Tamsin's mind raced. If the senator's fixer was here, he wouldn't stop until he saw bodies. She needed to reach the secondary bunker, but the path was blocked by a heavy security gate that required a dual authentication code she didn't have. She stopped at a junction, her back to the cold stone. She could hear the distinct click of a magazine being seated in a rifle just around the corner. They were boxed in. Tamsin looked at a series of high-pressure steam valves lining the wall. Dante's words echoed. "Every door is a lie. Use the environment." She reached for a heavy wrench hanging from the emergency rack. As the first shadow rounded the corner, Tamsin didn't fire a weapon. She slammed the wrench into the primary steam release. A deafening hiss erupted, filling the narrow corridor with a blinding, scalding white cloud. The assassin's scream was cut short by the roar of the pressure. In the chaos and the fog, Tamsin grabbed Leo and dove through a small ventilation duct she had spotted in the blueprints. They tumbled into a lower storage room, coughing and covered in soot. Tamsin quickly braced the door with a heavy steel rack. She looked at her hands. They were shaking, but her grip was sure. She looked at Leo, who was staring at her with something that looked like awe. "We're okay," she panted, checking her sidearm. "We're going to find Dante." The fortress had been violated, the sanctuary broken. But as Tamsin watched the door, waiting for the next shadow, she knew the senator had made a catastrophic mistake. He had sent killers into a house, but he had forgotten that he had turned a waitress into a predator. The aftermath of the breach left the estate smelling of ozone, spent brass, and the metallic tang of blood. The secondary bunker, a reinforced sub-basement hidden beneath the wine cellar, was the only place that felt remotely safe. Dante sat on a low bench, his shirt discarded as he cleaned a shallow graze on his shoulder. The harsh fluorescent lights carved deep valleys into the muscles of his back, making him look less like a kingpin and more like a fallen gladiator. Tamsin sat across from him, her hands finally still as she cleaned the soot from Leo's face. The boy had fallen into an exhausted, fitful sleep on a nearby cot, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The silence between the two adults was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the reinforced walls. "The traitor was Miller," Dante said, his voice grating like stone on stone. "He'd been with my family for 12 years. Sterling didn't just offer him money. He offered him immunity for a crime I didn't know he'd committed. Everyone has a price, Tamsin. I simply forgot to keep track of his." Tamsin looked up, her eyes hard. "He almost killed Leo. He almost killed us both." Dante looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "But he didn't. Because of you. You used the steam valves. That wasn't in the manual." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You have a talent for improvisation that can't be trained." He stood up, ignoring the wound on his shoulder, and walked over to a heavy wall safe. He keyed in a sequence and pulled out a weathered, leather-bound journal and a single, grainy photograph. He set them on the table between them. "I told you I was Leo's uncle," Dante began, his tone dropping to a whisper. "But I didn't tell you how I lost his mother, my sister, Elena. She was a journalist. She found out that Sterling's urban renewal projects were actually a front for a massive human trafficking and money laundering ring. She thought the truth would protect her. She thought the light would scare the cockroaches away." He pushed the photograph toward Tamsin. It showed a younger, smiling Dante with a woman who had the same defiant spark in her eyes that Tamsin now carried. "They staged a car accident," Dante continued, his jaw tightening. "They took her life and tried to take her son to use as leverage against me. I've spent every second since then building this fortress, gathering pieces of the puzzle, waiting for the moment Sterling felt safe enough to trip over his own ego." Tamsin picked up the journal. As she flipped through the pages, filled with Elena's frantic, cramped handwriting, a name jumped out at her. Vane. Her breath hitched. She saw her father's name scrawled in the margins next to a date she knew by heart. The day her family's life had been dismantled by a random, regulatory investigation that led to her father's heart attack and their subsequent ruin. "My father wasn't just a social worker," Tamsin whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "He was Elena's source. He was the one feeding her the data from the city's records." Dante nodded slowly. "Your father was the only one brave enough to help her. Sterling didn't just ruin your family because he could. He did it because your father was the primary witness to the first Emerald Vault deals. You aren't here by accident, Tamsin. I didn't just find you at that club. I have been looking for you for months. I needed to see if the daughter had the same spine as the father." The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the gravity of the revelation. The mission was no longer about a job or a paycheck. It was a legacy of blood and justice. Tamsin felt a cold, white-hot fire ignite in her chest. The fear that had dogged her steps since the Emerald Vault finally evaporated, replaced by a singular, lethal purpose. She stood up and walked to the table, placing her hand directly over the photograph of Elena and her father's name. She looked Dante in the eye, and for the first time, they stood as equals in the dark. "I want him gone," she said, her voice devoid of tremor. "I don't want to just protect Leo. I want to take everything Sterling has. I want to burn his empire until there's nothing left but ash." Dante reached out, his hand covering hers. The contact was no longer a teacher guiding a student. It was a pact. "Then we make it official. No more hiding. No more waiting for them to come to us. We go into the heart of his world, and we tear the heart out." "Whatever it takes," Tamsin replied. "Whatever it takes," Dante echoed. In the dim light of the bunker, surrounded by the ghosts of their families, the waitress and the kingpin swore a blood oath. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the architects of a reckoning. The air in the server room was a sharp contrast to the decadent warmth of the gala. It was freezing, humming with the mechanical drone of high-velocity cooling fans and the rhythmic, hypnotic blinking of 1,000 blue and green LEDs. This was the digital heart of Sterling's empire, a cold, windowless vault where human lives were reduced to strings of encrypted code. Tamsin worked with a feverish intensity. The progress bar on her handheld device flickered at 99%. The heavy thud of footsteps outside the study had stopped, followed by the muffled sound of a heated conversation. Sterling was close. She could almost smell the sulfur of his presence through the reinforced walls. Click! The device glowed a steady, triumphant gold. Data secured. She breathed into her calms. "I have a ledger. Dante, I'm moving to the extraction point." "Negative, Tamsin." Abort the primary exit. Dante's voice crackled, sharp and urgent. The fixer just bypassed the ballroom perimeter. They know the thumbprint was a ghost. They're locking down the wing. "Get out of there now." Tamsin didn't waste a second. She didn't head for the door. She headed for the server racks. She had memorized the architectural overrides. She pulled a small thermite charge from the thigh holster hidden beneath her silk skirts and slapped it onto the central processor. If she couldn't take the physical servers, she would ensure no one else could ever use them again. As she turned to flee toward the ventilation shaft, a monitor on the far wall flared to life. Her heart stopped. It was a live feed from a holding cell somewhere in the basement of the estate. In the center of the frame, Leo sat on a cold metal chair, his small face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that shattered Tamsin's hard-won composure. Standing behind him, a hand resting with mocking gentleness on the boy's shoulder, was the fixer, a man whose face was a map of surgical scars and cold indifference. "Lady Vane." A voice boomed over the server room's intercom. It was Sterling. He sounded calm, his tone dripping with the arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. "You have something of mine. I have something of yours. I believe the trade is self-explanatory." "Tamsin, don't listen to him." Dante's voice hissed in her ear, though she could hear the strain of combat in the background, the roar of an engine, the shatter of glass. "It's a trap. He's using the boy to pull you into the open. I'm 4 minutes out." "He doesn't have 4 minutes, Dante," Tamsin whispered, her gaze locked on Leo's trembling form on the screen. The weight of the encrypted ledger in her hand felt like a mountain. This data could dismantle the Cabal, clear her father's name, and protect thousands of others. But looking at Leo, she realized that justice was an abstract concept if it was bought with the life of the child she had sworn to protect. She didn't wait for Dante's counterargument. She ripped the earpiece out. Tamsin abandoned the ventilation shaft and moved toward the service elevator. She wasn't running for the exit anymore. She was descending into the dark. She bypassed the security protocols by shorting the panel with her stun baton, the elevator car dropping with a stomach-churning lurch toward the sublevels. When the doors slid open, the basement was a maze of concrete and shadows. She stepped out, her emerald gown torn at the hem, her silver mask discarded. She looked like a fallen angel, but she moved with the lethal intent of a reaper. She found the room from the monitor. It was an old cold storage area, the walls sweating with moisture. The fixer stood in the center of the room, a jagged combat knife balanced in his hand. Leo was huddled in the corner, his silent tears tracking lines through the dust on his cheeks. The drive, the fixer said, his voice a dry rasp. Slide it across the floor, and the boy lives long enough to see the sun rise. Maybe. Tamsin held the drive up between two fingers. You want a ledger? Come and get it. She didn't slide it. She threw it. Not at him, but into the darkness of a deep floor drain across the room. As the fixer's eyes instinctively followed the arc of the priceless data, Tamsin lunged. She didn't use a gun. She used the environment, the shadows, and the raw, unadulterated rage of a woman who was done being a victim. The climax had begun. The server room was burning upstairs, the data was in the shadows, and in the bowels of the senator's estate, the waitress was finally going to show the fixer what happens when you threaten a Linus's cub. The basement air exploded in a symphony of violence. As the fixer lunged for the floor drain, Tamsin moved with a lethal fluidity that months of Dante's brutal training had burned into her muscle memory. She didn't fight like a soldier. She fought like someone who had nothing left to lose. She caught the fixer's wrist, the bones snapping under the leverage of her grip, and drove her elbow into the hinge of his jaw. But the fixer was a creature of the dark, a man who had survived 100 such encounters. He rolled with the blow, kicking Tamsin's legs out from under her. They hit the concrete floor in a tangle of limbs and gasping breaths. Above them, the estate groaned as the thermite charges Tamsin had planted in the server room began to eat through the building's infrastructure. Dust and plaster rained down like gray snow. You think you're a hero? The fixer hissed, pinning Tamsin against a damp pillar, his fingers crushing her windpipe. You're just a ghost in a pretty dress. Tamsin's vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening. She looked past the fixer's scarred face and saw Leo. The boy had stood up. He wasn't hiding anymore. He had picked up a heavy glass paperweight from a nearby desk. With a silent, primal scream, Leo threw it. It struck the fixer in the back of the head. Not enough to kill him, but enough to break his focus. The pressure on Tamsin's throat vanished. She sucked in a jagged lungful of air and reached for the hidden blade she had sheathed in the small of her back. In one clean, decisive motion, she drove the steel home. The fixer slumped against her, his cold eyes wide with a final, flickering surprise before they went dull. She pushed the body away and scrambled toward Leo, pulling him into a fierce embrace. I've got you. I've got you. The building shuddered again, a deep, resonant boom that felt like the earth itself was cracking. The tactical raid had begun. From the stairwell, a team of black-clad operatives led by Dante burst into the room. Dante's suit was torn, his face streaked with soot and blood, but when his eyes landed on Tamsin and Leo, the terrifying coldness in his gaze softened for a fraction of a second. Get him out of here, Dante commanded his men, his voice a low growl. He stepped toward Tamsin, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet. Sterling is trying to reach his helipad. The ledger. Tamsin pointed to the floor drain. I used it as bait. It's in a waterproof casing, but we have to move. They surged upward, moving through a house that was rapidly becoming a tomb of marble and fire. The gala guests had fled, leaving behind a wreckage of spilled champagne and discarded masks. They reached the roof just as the blades of Sterling's private helicopter began to whine, cutting through the smoke-filled night air. Senator Sterling stood on the edge of the pad, his face twisted in a mask of panicked rage. He held a briefcase, his emergency exit strategy, and looked at the two figures emerging from the smoke. You, Sterling screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Tamsin. You're nothing. A waitress. A nobody. You can't end this. I'm the daughter of the man you murdered, Tamsin said, her voice rising above the roar of the rotors. And I'm the woman who just burned your world to the ground. Dante stepped forward, his weapon leveled with terrifying steadiness. The ledger is already being uploaded to every major news outlet and federal agency in the country, Sterling. Your assets are frozen. Your friends have already turned on you to save themselves. There is no helipad at the end of this run. Only a cell. Sterling looked at the helicopter, then at the sheer drop off the side of the estate's cliffside terrace. The arrogance that had fueled his life for decades finally collapsed. He saw the fire leaping from the windows below him, the physical manifestation of his legacy turning to ash. He didn't wait for the handcuffs. In a final, desperate act of cowardice, he turned and ran toward the edge. Dante reached out to stop him, but Tamsin caught his arm. They watched as the man who had played God with their lives disappeared into the darkness of the canyon below. There was no grand speech, no final plea, just the hollow sound of the wind. Dante turned to Tamsin. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years of justice finally delivered. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of soot from her cheek. "It's over," he whispered. Tamsin looked out over the city. The Emerald Vault was a world away. She felt the weight of the silver mask she had once worn, realizing she no longer needed it. She wasn't a waitress, and she wasn't a ghost. She was the survivor who had brought the dawn. The sunlight that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dante Moretti's coastal estate didn't feel like the harsh, clinical fluorescent glare of the Emerald Vault. It was warm, honeyed, and carried the scent of salt air and blooming jasmine. For the first time in years, Tamsin Vane didn't wake up to the frantic mental inventory of bills she couldn't pay or the phantom weight of a serving tray on her shoulder. Instead, there was silence, but not this suffocating silence of the oppressed. It was the quiet of a house that had finally exhaled. Downstairs, the atmosphere had shifted from a fortress on high alert to a home in recovery. The black-clad security teams were still there, moving like shadows along the perimeter, but their presence no longer felt like a threat to Tamsin. They were the walls she had helped build. As she walked through the marble hall, she caught her reflection in a gilded mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the invisible waitress who had bowed her head to Senator Sterling. Her eyes were sharp, her posture was effortless, and the fine silk of her blouse hid the faint, healing bruise on her ribs from the gala's final stand. She was a survivor who had crossed the fire and brought back the light. She found Leo on the terrace, a sketchbook spread across his knees. For months, the boy had been a ghost, a silent witness to the cruelty of men who thought power was measured in fear. Now his pencil moved with a rhythmic, confident scratch. He didn't flinch when Tamsin approached. He simply looked up, his eyes bright and focused, and did something that still made Tamsin's heart skip a beat. "Look, Tamsin," he said. His voice was small, slightly raspy from disuse, but it was clear. "I drew the lion. He's guarding the gates." Tamsin knelt beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "He's doing a very good job, Leo. But look closer. Who is that standing next to him?" Leo pointed to a smaller figure in the drawing, a woman with a sword made of light. "That's you. You're the one who told the monsters to stop." A lump formed in Tamsin's throat. She had entered the Emerald Vault thinking her life was a series of unfortunate accidents, a slow drowning in a world that didn't care if she sank. She had thought her empathy was a liability, the very thing that had left her penniless and vulnerable. But as she looked at the boy she had plucked from the clutches of a conspiracy, she realized that her weakness had been the only thing strong enough to shatter the senator's empire. Sterling had commanded legions of bought men, but he had never commanded loyalty, and he certainly hadn't accounted for a woman who had nothing left to lose but her soul. "He's right, you know." Dante's voice was like velvet over gravel. He stood in the doorway, the morning sun casting his long shadow across the stone. The lethal, cold kingpin who had silenced a room with a look was still there, but the edges were softer. He looked at Leo with a gaze that was no longer haunted by the ghost of his sister, but anchored by the presence of his nephew. Dante walked toward them, handing Tamsin a tablet. The headlines were a digital wildfire. Sterling Empire collapses, federal indictments handed down. The anonymous Lady Vane identified as hero in human trafficking sting. The digital ledger she had pulled from the vault had done more than just end the senator. It had dismantled a network of corruption that had throttled the city for decades. Her father's name had been cleared in the process, the accident that ruined her family finally exposed as the targeted hit it was. "The assets have been seized," Dante said quietly, leaning against the stone balustrade. Your family's estate is being restored. You have enough to live a dozen lives, Tamsin. You could go anywhere, be anyone. Tamsin looked out at the ocean, then back at the man who had seen a spark of defiance in a waitress and decided to fan it into a flame. She thought about the fortress he had built and how it had become her sanctuary. She thought about the training, the adrenaline of the mission, and the way her pulse quickened, not just from the danger, but from the man standing beside her. I spent my whole life trying to be invisible just to survive, Tamsin said, her voice steady and sure. I'm not interested in running away anymore. I think the city still has a few monsters left that need to be dealt with. Dante's lips quirked into the rarest of things, a genuine smile. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, a silent pact sealed in the aftermath of the storm. The waitress was gone. The victim was dead. In their place stood the architect of a new dawn, a woman who had walked into the lion's den and decided to stay. Then we have work to do, Dante replied. As they stood together overlooking the shimmering water, Leo started a new page in his book. The shadows of the Emerald Vault were long gone, replaced by the brilliant, unapologetic light of a future they had fought to earn. Tamsin Vane was no longer waiting for her life to begin. She was finally the one holding the pen. The dawn has arrived, but a new threat is rising from the ashes of Sterling's empire. Would you like me to generate the prologue for the sequel, where Tamsin takes on her first official mission as Dante's equal partner? Drop your opinion in the comment section.